Yes, Lavish, you can begin now.
Good evening. Welcome to CSEP's flagship seminar on climate change policy for developing countries, where our distinguished fellow and accomplished economist and reformer, Mr. Montek Ahluwalia, will talk about the key directions from his joint work with Utkarsh Patel, who is an associate fellow at CSEP. Following this, we have a highly regarded panelist group and discussants who would be presenting their thoughts on this work and also the wider canvas that they cover. Our panelists include Mr. Nitin Desai, among India's most distinguished economist and thought leader, heard carefully across the world and globally, with a career spanning key posts in the UN, the Government of India, and of course the advisory domain. Dr. Anshu Bharadwaj is the CEO of Shakti Foundation and one of the very few experts with a deep understanding of the nitty-gritties of Indian administration, as well as an in-depth perspective on the energy and environment spaces. Dr. Mekhala Krishnan is a partner at McKinsey Global Institute and has worked widely in the environment space. She was an author of the recently published Climate Risk and Response work from McKinsey and has also worked in the socioeconomic impacts of climate transition. Ms. Ulka Kelkar is a director, climate program at the World Resource Institute, India. She works on climate issues with a special emphasis on the pathway to climate resilient, low carbon economy through economic policies, market mechanisms, and of course, effective implementation. So I'll keep this short, the introduction. I would now request Mr. Ahluwalia to present his thoughts. We have assigned about 25 to 30 minutes to your talk, Mr. Ahluwalia. We won't take any questions in between, but of course, in case there are any clarificatory issue from the panelists, I would allow them. We'll try and keep it a bit informal in that sense. So all yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Lavish, on behalf of myself and Utkarsh, giving us this opportunity and collecting such a very distinguished panel to comment. And we are actually looking forward to hearing their comments, which hopefully will incentivize me to be very brief. Now, I realize that for those in the audience who wanted a full exposition of the paper, this strategy may not be very good. So I would just urge them to read the paper. There's much more in paper than what I will say. And I think this will touch on the critical things around which our discussion can be based. See, the first thing is that the paper summarized is meant to examine that now that COP26 has happened and we've reached some sort of an agreement, what does it imply for developing countries as a group? It's not a paper addressed to India, although Utkarsh and I are working on something more specific for India. So a lot of what the panelists say will be of immense value to us as we produce the version relevant for India. But this is for developing countries as a group. So point number one is, what are the main achievements of COP26? I think the main achievement really is that you've got for the first time, got a commitment from all developing countries that they will reduce their emissions down to net zero by some distant time. Different N0 dates for different countries, but this is the first time that this has happened. And you know, in the history of the negotiations, this is an important thing because right up to 2009, developing countries were taking the view that, look, we don't have to make commitments. You guys have caused the problem. You're the ones that should be trying to reduce commitments, reduce emissions. In 2009, there was a recognition that developing countries must also make some commitments. And this recognition got transformed into the Paris 2015 commitments, which did not involve a reduction in emissions, but the first acceptance of some mitigation action. Now we move further in COP26 that developing countries have said, okay, we actually intend to reduce our emissions over a certain period. So that's important. Now, does this solve the problem? The answer is no. And it doesn't solve the problem for the simple reason that the commitments, when added up, are not consistent with the global objective, which was to keep global warming to about 1.5 degrees centigrade. And secondly, there's a big empty hole as far as financial assistance is concerned. So we look at each of these things, but let me just put the scale of the problem through the first graph that I would like Utkarsh to put up. You get a sense of what we are talking about. So first graph, Utkarsh. Now, you know, this graph, the red line, which jumps up and down, is the actual temperature. And you can see that sometime around 1930 or something, it becomes significant, it starts edging up above the pre-industrial level and keeps rising. I mean, there are year-to-year variations, but the trend is very clear, okay? And then what the dotted line, the dotted red line is really the projection after Paris, if the Paris Agreement commitments were actually observed. And that would actually keep rising to much above the tolerable level of temperature. We then take a look at the pink horizontal bar. You know, the pink horizontal bar is what you would call, on the basis of the lower end of it, is where temperature would end up. On the most optimistic assumption about the COP26 obligations being met, and the upper end suggests what will happen if, as in the past, you know, these commitments are not fully met. So if you take the more pessimistic view, I mean, we will be ending up about 2.4 degrees higher than the pre-industrial level, whereas the maximum tolerable was around 1.5. So we are way above what the global warming target is. So what do we need to do in order to achieve the global warming target? That's what the dotted red line shows. I mean, the dotted blue line is what has to be done for the CO2 concentration, and the dotted red line is the resulting temperature change. So if you really want to limit the temperature increase as much as you say, it is the difference between the projection and this sharply curving down line which we have to achieve. And the Glasgow results are probably somewhere between the pink block, horizontal block that you see. So actually, while in some sense we've done quite a lot, it's certainly not enough. So a hell of a lot more has to be done to bend the curve downwards. It's just a visual demonstration that although the Glasgow commitments were remarkable and a first-time achievement, they're simply not enough. Now let's have a look, Utkarsh, at the second chart, which tells you a little bit more about what we have to do. Now here, we made an estimate of what the Glasgow pledges would do in terms of the top 8 CO2 emitters, and how much of the remaining carbon budget. This is what column 3A shows, that if the global Glasgow pledges are actually realized, what would each country take up of the remaining global carbon budget? And you can see that all 8 together would take up 115% of the global carbon budget, which really means that, and this lot actually account for about 57% of the population. So one cannot imagine that the remaining 43%, most of whom are developing countries, are actually going to see negative emissions in order for the global carbon budget to be maintained. We then have 2 other columns. One is a column that forces everybody to get to net zero by 2050. And if you do that, then it turns out that basically about 67% of the carbon budget is taken up by these 57 countries. They're still not very equitable, but within these countries, the difference is actually quite sharp. In the sense that the United States, which has 4% of the world's population, takes up 14.1% of the global carbon budget, and China, which has 18.5% of the world's population, takes up 25.5% of the global carbon budget. So even this is not really quite fair. And then we have a third hypothetical sort of distribution in which countries are forced to constrain their emissions much closer to their share of population. In other words, the share of the remaining carbon budget as estimated by IPCC, which the country takes up, is made much closer to what its actual world population share is. And that is a fairer and more sustainable end result. Now, the main point that I want to make in this is somewhere emissions have to be reduced even below what is agreed in Glasgow, and that reduction will be differential across different countries because they're taking up disproportionate shares of the global carbon budget. And I think Glasgow recognized this and very shrewdly said this is postponed to be discussed in COP27. So what's been done is an achievement. It still has to be modified. It's been pushed to another negotiation. And obviously, developing countries will have to be ready to deal with that negotiation and plan for it in advance. Okay, we can take this chart off. Now, what can we do? Clearly, in the longer run, we have to be ready to meet what is a sustainable set of projections. But in the short run, we should be ready to meet the projections we've actually promised to meet ourselves. So 50 years is a very long time for anybody to do any planning. And it has a huge advantage that you can always say there's lots of uncertainty, technology will change, and somehow or the other things will sort themselves out in future. But a practical approach would be that we need a 10-year plan. That is, if this is where we want to get in 2070, let's say in the case of India, what are we going to do in the next 10 years? And for purposes of international monitoring of each other's performance, it's really the plan for the next 10 years that is the most important. And I mean, if you ask yourself, what is it that you can do? The broad category of what can be done is very easily identified. One of them, clearly, is you've got to take steps to increase the efficiency, the energy efficiency of the system so that you need less energy to produce whatever GDP you want to produce. So that's the first point. The second point, which is now possible, is that you can move away from non-electrical energy to electrical energy, which means electrify as much as possible. And the third is that the electricity should become renewable rather than fossil fuel based. Now, by the way, electrification by itself doesn't help very much if you don't actually move to renewable electricity. But the two together are what enable you to break away from the old idea that you would compromise growth if you actually have to reduce your emissions, because it's now possible to have the energy you want, but switch the type of energy so that it doesn't generate emissions. I mean, that's a very broad kind of framework. So what do we do? Well, the first thing is on energy efficiency. I think there are two categories of action that one can think of. One is clearly the straight price incentive. The higher energy is priced, the more likely it is to be saved. And I mean, there's lots of discussions on energy subsidies, very controversial. We have introduced all kind of phrasing in the Glasgow Agreement, which says that inefficient energy subsidies should be removed. Nobody knows which subsidy is inefficient, so this can become a basis for discussion. But frankly, to my mind, given that the technology now exists for direct cash transfer, there is an overwhelming case for eliminating all subsidy in electricity and substituting it for a direct cash transfer to those who really think deserve the electricity. Hugely controversial, especially when farmers are involved, and that's something that everybody knows. I won't go into, but you know, we need to take a position on that for ourselves. In other words, in the next 10 years, this is something that we should put high up on the agenda. That what are we going to do about pricing of energy, and more specifically, pricing of electricity, in order to incentivize the new economy. Now, linked to this is the carbon taxation problem. Because, you know, if you want to move away from coal and you want to move away from carbon intensive energy, then the logical thing from a price point of view is to tax it. And if you tax it, then in effect, you will incentivize the alternative, which is obviously renewable energy. You know, the other approach is that you subsidize the renewable energy. And frankly, if our fiscal position allowed it, one should be indifferent between the two. The problem is the fiscal position in most countries, and certainly in India, does not allow huge subsidies to be borne, especially when the renewable energy scale is expanded. And that only emphasizes that we need to go much more into charging a cost of energy which reflects the social cost. And that's, I won't go into that. That's an issue, and I'd love to hear the view of panelists, whether this is even remotely possible in the next 10 years to do something, not everything, but to do something. Now let's comment a little bit in the time that's still left on the other two elements. One is electrifying everything. Now, you know, most energy is already electrified. The two areas where the electrification is can be done is really in transport. We have the technology for virtually everything except heavy transport, sea-going transport, and air transport. But how is it going to happen? Now, you know, the nice thing about this is that all over the world, everybody has agreed that we must electrify the vehicle fleet. I think we need to ask ourselves, what is a credible pace of electrification of the fleet in the next 10-year period? Probably not that much, because, you know, even in the United States, they're talking about going to 50 to 70% of vehicles sold being electric by 2030. But the important point is that both in Europe and in America, they're announcing that they're going to do this. So manufacturers have an advanced signal. They won't be able to sell a vehicle based on internal combustion engines beyond a certain point. I think we need to do something similar. It's not good enough to have something like FAME 1, FAME 2, which are really based on subsidizing the electrical vehicles. Now, actually, the scale is so small that at the moment, the subsidy may look small. But the idea that we are going to convert, move to 80, 90% of vehicle sales being electric based on subsidy just doesn't make sense. So can we have a firm announcement that with effect from a certain date, manufacturers have to be able to provide electric vehicles? That's a policy issue. At the moment, much of the energy is focused on saying we are getting 20,000 electric buses, where government is going to buy electric vehicles, but that's not going to make a difference to the overall scale of the fleet. So we need that. Second, that's the role of statutory action in addition to price incentives. Now, linked to this, obviously, is bringing in hydrogen, both for hard to abate areas, cement, fertilizer, steel, etc., and also some of the heavier transport applications. We will need to have hydrogen. What is a 10-year plan for hydrogen? This is a long-term issue, because at the moment, the technology exists to produce hydrogen using electrolyzers and electricity which is renewable. But the amount of hydrogen that has to be produced in order to make a credible difference 20 and 30 years from now, what you need in the next 10 years is a clear indication of what are the things we need to do now to trigger that process. And this is an area in which the Indian corporate sector, both the private sector and the public corporate sector, could be quite actively involved. Many of them have made statements. I think the chairman of Reliance, Mr. Mukesh Ambani, has said that Reliance has a goal of producing hydrogen, bringing the cost down from whatever $6 a kg at the moment to $1 a kg. Now that would be wonderful if that happens. So we want to know: are all the corporates who could do this on train for doing this? What is it that is needed in terms of government support for this to be done? Now, linked to all these things, electrolyzers, batteries. I mean, for example, if we're going to switch to electrification in the years ahead, and I'll come to that in a minute, one of the critical things is going to be how to manage the natural variability of renewable energy supply. And clearly one solution is batteries. The volume of batteries that we would have to produce very large, and therefore it raises an obvious question. Can we ensure that there will be domestic production? I mean, if you're going to be such a big demander of batteries, quite frankly, it's an area where we should be producing and also exporting. So is our present framework of a PLI adequate to support such a thing? And one of the problems really with batteries is that you can give a little bit of protection, but if you rely on too much protection, you're making the battery more expensive. What is worse is that we shouldn't, in my view, resort to anything like an import ban. I mean, for example, in order to promote drones, we have actually banned the import of all drones. Now, this, to my mind, is a wrong way of going about things, because with batteries, there will be changes in technology taking place around the world. So I think we should have a clear decision that there will be some protection, modest, but that will only be tariff protection. And if people are willing to pay that tariff and bring in an imported battery because it's superior in some technological way, that should not be prevented. Now, the argument against that will be that China has very non-transparent pricing. Then we handle that separately. And you need to have ways of putting in countervailing duties specifically for China supplies if you think that their pricing is actually unfair. But an outright ban on battery imports from everywhere, to my mind, would be the wrong thing to do. So there are, if you take a whole of the economy approach, there are a number of questions that come up as to how we are going to bring about this transition. Let me just, can I request Utkarsh to show the chart on RE? Could you do that? Yeah. Now, this is just to give you an idea of
Mr. Ahluwalia, you have 10 more minutes.
10 more minutes, that's more than enough. Okay. This is just to give you an idea of what we've got to achieve compared with what we've been achieving. We very often say that we get very pleased that things are moving in the right direction. And believe me, they are moving in the right direction. I mean, the height of this bar going up to January 22 is actually the total variable RE generation capacity. Okay, and you can see that it's gone up. But the target for Jan 23 was 175 gigawatts, and in Jan 22 we are at about 115 gigawatts, and we have kind of been increasing about 12 gigawatts a year. In order to get to the target that we set ourselves, 450 gigawatts by January 31, the rate at which RE capacity increases has to go up to about 40 gigawatts per year. So the value of setting a 10-year annual plan is that year after year, we will be able to judge whether we are actually getting there. I mean, I think it's good to have terminal year targets, but the importance of a 10-year plan is that you spell out how you're going to get there. So in between, if you're not getting there, we'll find out why we're not getting there and then try to correct it. I would say that on renewable energy, at the moment, there's a huge amount, in one dimension, there's a huge amount of enthusiasm, a lot of which is actually justified. But I think we have to recognize that we are behind target, and we've now jacked up the target very substantially. So for us to be able to achieve this would require a fantastic performance. Now, there are areas we've done that. I mean, things like software exports, telecom connectivity. We've seen similar booms. But the question is, are we likely to see that in the RE space? And here, quite frankly, one of the biggest problems, and this is going to be very relevant, is are the distribution companies financially in a position to be able to persuade enough private sector investors to set up this capacity? If the capacity were being set up by the public sector, then that question would just be forgotten, and you would just sort of keep investing and say, well, we'll sort that out later. But if the investment is going to be done by the private sector, then the ability of the distribution companies to pay becomes important. Now, at the moment, we finesse that problem because it's the central government's corporation that puts out the bids, buys the power, and then sends it on to distribution company. So the central government is in effect provided a buffer, and it's taking the burden on itself. But if it turns out that the state distribution company's financial position does not improve, then basically very soon it will not be possible for the central government to continue through this mechanism. So you have to ask yourself, are we doing enough? What is a credible 10-year plan to ensure that the distribution companies have become financially viable? Now, in the bits that remain, I mean, I can't cover everything, but I'd like to say a few things about finance. In the discussions, international discussions, there's a lot of talk that financial assistance is needed because the scale of the transformation is immense, which is true. And we've looked at different estimates of how much financing is needed. So just consider the following. The present position is that we have, at the moment, about $80 billion flowing in from the outside in the form of climate finance to developing countries other than China. Estimates are that this group, if they are to achieve the kind of transformation that is necessary, will need additional investments of something of the order of $1 trillion per year. And there are other estimates that are higher. This is just one of them. $1 trillion against an actual delivery so far of 80 billion, which we are promised will become 100 billion by 2023 or 24. So, we have a lot of hard decisions to make in determining whether this is financeable. So what we have suggested in our paper is that the first thing we have to recognize is that all of this cannot come from external finance. So we are saying if 40% were to be financed internally, now obviously the percentage would vary from country to country, but you're looking at developing countries as a whole, let's say 40% were to come from internal sources, then 60% is what could come internationally. Now, if 1 trillion is the relevant benchmark, that means 600 billion has to come from international finance. In many of the discussions, there's a lot of confidence that there's a lot of private sector money going around. I mean, during the Glasgow conference, there was reference to the GFANZ Alliance, a bunch of financial companies that together control $131 trillion of assets. But the point is, what is the probability that this can be, in their view, deployed with an adequate risk-adjusted return in developing countries? And I think the present prospects are that it is not very likely at all. So our thinking was that the only way this can happen, and even that is a bit of a long shot, is if a lot of the money were to come from multilateral development banks. Some of this would be geared to bringing about reforms within the energy sector, reforms that would make the energy sector more viable. That would, in fact, trigger more private interest and private investment coming in. And we had thought that if $250 billion was a target for public money, then 350 billion could be the leveraged private finance. This 200.
Mr. Ahluwalia,
Yep.
may I ask you?
2 minutes left.
That's right.
Okay. This 250 billion has to be a combination of bilateral and multilateral. Our view is that we should push as much as possible to go through the multilateral route, because whatever resources the Western countries have, if they put it through the multilateral institutions, they'll be able to leverage up and borrow much more from the market and channel the rest, the available amount to developing countries. This runs into two huge problems. One, within Western countries, there seems to be very little appetite to expand the role of multilateral development banks. How we handle that is one question. You know, internally, we don't seem to be asking for money from the multilateral development banks. We seem to be asking for money through the UN climate funds. And quite frankly, the reason is that we believe that that would be without conditionality. But the probability of getting any significant flows from that source is very, very low. So I think we would have to change our own tune and move to MDBs. Now, my last 4 sentences, Lavish, is that, you know, if you're going to do it through multilateral development banks, then obviously the UNFCCC, which is the principal framework for the broader negotiations, is not the relevant framework for getting policy on MDBs done. That is usually done by the G20, which includes all the important developing countries. And we have a unique situation at the moment because you have a G20 which is chaired by Indonesia for this year, India for next year, Brazil for the year after that. So you've got the G20 being chaired by 3 developing countries in the next 3-year period. Could these 3 sufficiently impact the agenda of the G20 to make the G20 focus on this problem and create a viable financing strategy through the MDBs? I don't know the answer to that, but to my mind, the opportunity is too good to miss. So, Lavish, I apologize if I've overstretched by some seconds or even a minute, but I'll stop at this point and really hand it over back to you. Thank you.
Thank you. And no, you did not. I'm quite pleasantly surprised. I mean, for such a such an intense paper. So I'll ask Dr. Bharadwaj to be the first panel discussant.
Thank you, Lavish. It's a pleasure to be here, and I really enjoyed the presentation given by Dr. Ahluwalia. I read the paper with a lot of interest and carefully read that, and I think it's a very nice overall summary and framework of what the developing countries in general ought to focus on. What I liked about the paper was that it's a nice historical summary of the climate negotiations going back to Kyoto till now, and sort of gives a nice historical context as to how this entire thing has evolved over time. It also the two main focus of the paper or emphasis, as Dr. Ahluwalia mentioned, one was on the modifying the country trajectories and the climate finance. I'll have some comments on that. I'll come to that in a bit. So I have broadly 5 sets of comments, and I'll wrap up in the time given to me. The first is in the opening part of the paper, the authors have talked about the impact of climate on GDP and productivity. I think that's a very important factor. Dr. Ahluwalia didn't speak about that in today's presentation, but I think that's a very important thing for us to work upon. We know that climate science, we know the impacts of climate change are happening and are real. That's a done, right? We know it. We also have some sense of understanding what might be the economic impacts. But we are not factoring that into our growth, economic projections, and macroeconomic calculations, probably because of the lack of tools or lack of understanding on how to do that. For example, when the economic survey says India is targeting to grow at 8% or whatever, how realistic is that growth? Does it take into account these likely adverse impacts of climate? Obviously not. Should it take into account? I think most definitely yes. Otherwise, we are misleading the direction the country is headed. For instance, when COVID came, we knew what was the impact on our growth, and we have quantified the negative tanking of GDP. I think it's very important that a similar mechanism be developed by discussion between climate scientists and the policymakers to figure out how to factor into account this into GDP baseline. Otherwise, my worry is that we'll keep projecting a GDP baseline, which may be totally unrealistic. And if your baseline is not good enough, any calculations you do over and above the baseline will also may not be accurate. So that's my first point. My second point on the modification of country trajectories, which has been presented, I have a somewhat different take on that. So yeah, it's a great deal that many countries committed to net zero, and the last COP got countries committed to this, which is great. I also completely agree that the developed countries need to do more. We should push them. Maybe they should, expedite their net zero dates. Their paths to net zero should be concave, not even linear, concave. Forget about convexity, but concave paths. I also agree that developing countries should not be pushed to have a common target. All that is fine. I agree with that. My point is that we should not have a mindset. I mean, we as in developing countries, we should not have a mindset that the date we get to net zero will be X decades beyond when developed countries get there. I think that's an important point. And the reason I say is because technology advances very rapidly and things change very, very rapidly. Dr. Ahluwalia might recall, just 7 years back, we had the Low Carbon Growth Committee report, which Dr. Parekh was chairing, which was submitted to the erstwhile Planning Commission. That report looked at 2030 targets. And in that report, we just about, very reluctantly, gingerly put some solar, that, naam ke vaste, some solar should be there. 7 years down the line, we are in a completely different paradigm where solar costs have fallen dramatically, and it's a very different world. So that would be my one point that on the technologies. The second point on the equitable outcome, and then that's a deeper point. The equitable argument is primarily based on the logic that our aspiration for a fair share of carbon budget is because it is closely coupled with growth, development, GDP, etc. Now that's been the case for last decades or even centuries. So yes, growth, GDP has been closely coupled with carbon. But I think that is beginning to change. There is evidence, partly because of economic reasons. The clean energy has an economic case. And number two, if you track India's GDP and carbon emissions over the last 10 years, and I did that exercise, there is a decoupling of carbon emissions from GDP. It's not a linear one-to-one correlation as most countries have seen. So I think that needs to be kept in mind when we talk about this. Population is not the only criteria, I think. For example, if a country has a very low carbon to GDP intensity, it should not provide an incentive or a perverse incentive to that country to go for a high carbon intensive pathway just to claim its quote unquote fair share. So that's my comment on that. My third comment is on the part on what developing countries should do. So I agree with broadly the various interventions suggested, and that those have been the interventions suggested by various modeling teams. The paper doesn't quantify the outcome of these interventions, but various modeling teams, including WRI, Ulka is here on the call, Lawrence Berkeley Labs, CEW, Tufts, and other modelers have attempted to quantify the impact of various interventions. In general, what emerges is similar to what the authors have presented in terms of, for example, electrification, the green hydrogen, retiring of old coal plants, carbon tax, so broadly similar. My quick comments on 2-3 points of the analysis. One is on the energy pricing. As Dr. Ahluwalia himself mentioned, it's a very difficult thing given the political challenges. My own sense is that the rate at which our energy demand is growing, especially in appliances, in cooling and other sectors, we cannot wait for the energy price rationalization to happen, given the political challenges. I think we need to find solutions which work through a mandate, like we did for the industry through the PAT scheme, something like a mandate which drives adoption of energy efficiency within the political context. The current elections have shown that it's going to be very difficult for this to happen.
Mr. Bhagwan, it's just 2 more minutes.
Yeah, I'm aware of that.
Thank you. Okay.
Industry and transport, I agree. The one thing on the freight, my slight disagreement is that it's generally understood that freight hydrogen is the solution. I think the jury is still out. Because there have been studies, including a recent paper in Nature, which examined that high-density batteries, along with charging infrastructure along the highways, could be the way to go. Of course, that's in the context of Europe, but I think the jury is still out. We need more analysis of life cycle assessments. Nuclear, I believe the country needs to understand the role of nuclear power. We have heard too many things. On the one hand, our atomic energy people say that nuclear will solve all the problems. On the other hand, we have seen nothing on the ground. I think there needs to be an honest assessment of what can nuclear do in the context, and an honest and objective assessment, which I think we have lacked. Which has been lacking so far. Last 2 points quickly. I just have 1 minute now. One point which Dr. Ahluwalia briefly mentioned in the paper on the institutional arrangements. I believe it's a very, very important point. So far, the climate policy has been done predominantly by MOEFCC. What we have now announced in terms of net zero is a completely new economic paradigm, which cuts across all ministries, state governments. And therefore, there is a need for, it's important for us to understand the enormity of what we have committed. It's a completely new paradigm, a new way of life. I think there is a need for a body, entity, I don't know what the appropriate word is, to give guidance with necessary legislative financial powers to ministries and to state governments. Could NITI be the place to host it? Perhaps yes, but then it will need to be significantly strengthened with analytical policy, research capacity to answer the kind of question which the authors have posed in the question. My last point on climate finance, I like the way they have segregated the finance requirements from public, private, international, domestic. It's a very nice framework. The numbers which you have put out are 1 trillion. I think broadly agree with what modelers are saying. One question I would have is that the additional investments or the cost, does it pose a penalty to growth or GDP, or does it stimulate GDP or growth? I think the authors have not commented on that. Some modeling studies done by, say, WRI, Cambridge Econometrics, and others suggest that a green pathway or a low carbon pathway could actually lead to slightly higher GDP marginally. Although I'm always wary of these long-term studies because there are so many uncertainties. But I think the narrative, at least in these studies, suggests that more investments, yes, but it leads to faster growth, at least doesn't penalize growth, and more jobs. So with that, I'll stop, and thanks again for the opportunity. And it's a very nice paper to comment on. Back to you, Lavish.
Thank you so much. Those were very interesting, insightful comments, and we'll take up on some of those a bit later in the Q&A. May I ask Dr. Ulka Kelkar to present?
Thank you very much, and thank you so much to the organizers for the opportunity to comment on this paper. I'll use a few minutes to say a few words about the issue of the carbon budget, and then I will pivot to something which is sort of headline news, breaking news for climate researchers today, which is the new IPCC report on impacts and adaptation and vulnerability has come out. So I'll discuss some of the key findings of that report and what it means for this paper, really. So let me just start with this issue of using our fair share of the carbon budget. In one study that we did, the report is not yet published, we worked with 4 other modeling teams and looked at a number of burden sharing approaches and looked at different types of models. So some were systems dynamics models, some were cost optimization models. And we really tried to look at what is India's fair share of the carbon budget under these different approaches. And we looked at the 1.5 degrees Celsius temperature limit, which is more stringent than the 2 degrees Celsius warming limit. And we looked at a particular burden sharing approach called equal cumulative per capita emissions, which really comes closest to the Government of India's stance in the negotiations, which is you take into account past historical responsibility for greenhouse gas emissions and the present fact that we have a larger population. If you look at this 1.5 degrees Celsius equal cumulative per capita emissions burden sharing formula and see how much India deserves in terms of its fair share to the carbon budget, what does it mean for where we need to be in 2030, 2040, and 2050, exactly the kinds of interim targets that Mr. Ahluwalia spoke about for sectors like electricity, industry, and transport. So basically what I'm asking is, how do you break the global budget into a national budget? How do you break the national budget into sectoral budgets? How do you break the sectoral budget for the future into interim milestones? And very quickly, we found out that the different models give widely different answers. And so the choice really becomes a political choice. And I'll give you the example of coal. If you look at how much installed capacity of coal power there needs to be in 2030, one model will tell you that it needs to be about as much as it is now. Another model will tell you that it can come down. A third model will tell you that it can grow to 300 gigawatts by 2030 and to 400 gigawatts by 2050. And India would still stay within its fair share of the carbon budget. So clearly the carbon budget is not a constraint for us. It becomes a bit of a political choice. If instead of growing your coal sector power capacity to 400 gigawatts by 2050 and still staying within the fair share of the global carbon budget, what if you were to bring it down to 0? The benefits would be something like 9 million premature deaths avoided due to air pollution and 12 billion cubic meters of water saved as a result of the fresh water used for cooling thermal power plants. So that's really the political choice. The models can only give you often contradictory guideposts as to where you need to be in 2030, 2040, or 2050. But this brings me to the point about what this report that has come out today is highlighting. One, that climate action, climate adaptation is becoming increasingly urgent. And I'm sure there are no surprises here. There are gaps in adaptation, which will grow. There are severe shortages in adaptation finance. And we are reaching the limits of adaptation. We're really reaching the limits of adaptation at current levels of warming. And as warming grows, the current adaptation options will become less and less effective. Diseases are emerging in new areas. Extreme weather events have already reduced economic growth in some areas. Because of developmental choices, more and more assets are being exposed to extreme events. And of course, it's no surprise that the most vulnerable communities and systems are the ones that are the most disproportionately impacted. For example, the report points out in the last 10 years alone, human mortality from extreme events in highly vulnerable regions is 15 times that in less vulnerable regions. So what does it mean for this report? Very similar for your paper, very similar to the point that Anshu just made. Are we overestimating the business as usual GDP? Well, in other words, are we underestimating the economic benefits of climate action? The second point that I want to talk about from this new IPCC report is that for the first time, this is a report that doesn't limit itself to just the science, but it talks about how climate action has to be inclusive. Otherwise, it will lead to maladaptive consequences. And it gives a number of examples, all of which kick in, especially when you're talking about the transformative scale of greenhouse gas emission reduction or sequestration that's required. So if you have large-scale afforestation on land that was not naturally a forest, or if you have hard defenses against floods, against flooding, this could lead to a number of maladaptive consequences. Right now, almost 1 billion people are living in low elevation coastal zones. And this is also something that is just exposing more and more people and assets to extreme weather events. So what does this mean for your paper? It basically means that when you're talking about the scale of transformative action, you need to explicitly account for the possible inadvertent consequences and the distributional impacts. Even if at an aggregate level, the impacts are positive, as some of our analysis shows, not necessarily true for specific income groups for specific regions. So there has to be an explicit mechanism for recycling revenue or directed cash transfers and so on. The third point that I want to make is that there is already a lot of evidence of maladaptation. So in a country like ours, climate change needs to be embedded in development planning and has to be integrated across sectors and across scales. And we all know that that is easier said than done. But it really comes down to everyday decisions about urban form, siting of urban infrastructure. It's fundamental to safeguard our dwindling biodiversity and ecosystems, green spaces in our cities, wetlands that protect us from extreme events. It means things like if we have our these low carbon energy systems that we are now creating, these need to be diversified and decentralized. Otherwise, they will be just as vulnerable to climate extreme impacts as other kinds of infrastructure. Again, what does this mean for this paper? That finance is scarce. And so one example, one particular tool or mechanism of embedding climate action into development planning is something called climate budget tagging, which is beginning to happen in more and more states in India. Odisha has done it, Bihar has done it, more and more states are doing it. And so it's a way of identifying what are the domestic budgetary resources available for adaptation. But as I said, it's also a tool to embed climate action into development planning in the short run. So let me just end with that, Lavish. Thank you so much for this time.
Thank you, Ulka. May I ask Dr. Meghla Krishnan?
Great, thanks, Lavish. Great to be here and really appreciate the remarks of my fellow panelists. It's been a very enlightening discussion so far. So what I wanted to do is actually share a little bit some of the findings from recent research we've done at the McKinsey Global Institute on the net zero transition and tie some of the findings from our research to some of the points highlighted in the paper as well as by some of the other panelists. The research was really a global piece of work, but as I go through some of the findings, what I'm going to try and do is highlight the implications for developing countries of some of the key points raised in the research and link back to the paper. So the starting point of the work was actually very similar to where the paper actually kicked off, which is where are we on our trajectory to limit warming to 1.5 C? And the headline is we're very far away. This is one illustration of that, where we've looked at a forward-leaning case on emissions reductions from McKinsey, which is what we call this reference case. It's a pretty aggressive forward-leaning case based on technology evolution, cost reduction, etc. And the dashed line shows globally where we need to be to limit warming to 1.5 C under one IPCC scenario. And so the headline is we need to bend the curve dramatically, even if we add up all the commitments, as was mentioned earlier, towards net zero. We're expecting warming to be about 2.1 to 2.2 degrees Celsius, so very far away from that 1.5 C number. And commitments on paper are very far from actions on the ground. So the commitments don't add up themselves, and translating those commitments to actions will be extremely challenging. So the starting point of our work was first and foremost saying, what do we actually need to solve this net zero equation, balance emissions with reductions, reduce emissions as much as we can? And we found that there were 9 requirements to solve this net zero equation. The first is a set of physical building blocks. This is things like technology, actually scaling up the deployment of technology. So it's not technological innovation alone, but also deployment through supply chains, enabling infrastructure, scaling of natural resources. What we call economic and societal adjustments. So this is a lot of the climate finance that we've been talking about on this discussion, but also some of what Ulka started to allude to. How do we make this transition inclusive and manage the uneven effects that different types of stakeholders and communities experience? There are certain sectors that are more exposed, certain countries that are more exposed, certain communities that are more exposed, both to climate change as well as to the net zero transition. How do we ensure those uneven effects are balanced? And then the whole set of commitments and enabling mechanisms that we need on the public and private sector leaders, the sets of enabling institutions. We've used the word institution a lot in this discussion so far. What are the sets of new institutions that we need to build towards getting us to net zero? So we feel like this framework is actually a helpful one because oftentimes the focus is on one or other parts of this, but really it needs to be a holistic agenda that covers all 9 of these, some of which we're further along than on others. So in fact, what we find is that when we look at the physical building blocks, as we've again talked about and this paper alludes to, we may actually be further along than we realize. As one example, we find that about 85% of the technologies that we need to get to net zero in Europe, this is a European example, but about 85% of those technologies already exist in some way, shape, or form. So this is not just an innovation problem alone. And so most of our work has really focused on this middle block of economic and societal adjustments where we feel like not as much work has happened and more is needed. And so what we identified is we looked at the economic shifts that are underway or will be underway under a net zero transition. What we find is that there are 6 characteristics of this net zero transition. It is universal, significant, front-loaded, meaning the next decade is decisive. We've talked about 2070, but we really need mileposts over the next 10 years if we are to get to that 2070 target for India, if we have to get to the 2050 target for the world. Uneven, it is exposed to risk. This is not going to be an easy journey for many, many different reasons. And there is a choice we have between a relatively more orderly and a relatively more disorderly transition. And at the same time, it comes with various kinds of opportunities. I won't have time today to talk about each of these, but I wanted to pick a few that were particularly pertinent and highlighted in the paper as well and in the remarks of some of the panelists. So the first is the fact that it is a whole-scale transformation of the economy. We've talked about the power sector and the need to decarbonize the power sector. We've talked about electrification that needs to happen in a set of end-use sectors like industry, mobility, buildings. But it's also sectors like agriculture that need to transform, it's waste that needs to transform. So this is every energy system that needs to transform if we are to get to net zero. If you look at all the bubbles on this chart, each across the different greenhouse gas categories. So all of them will need to reduce emissions. All of them will also need to reduce emissions in concert with each other. This is systems that need to collectively, and Dr. Ahluwalia talked about power and mobility are actually to reduce emissions. It is significant. We've talked in the paper about dollars of additional spending that is needed for developing countries. That spending to increase by about $3.5 trillion spending. This analysis takes into account both energy, so when we think of the power sector, but also energy consumption when we think about sectors like mobility or industry that need to transform. So globally, it's a step up of spending of about $3.5 trillion on a set of assets, a substantial scale up of spending.
Tekla, there is some disturbance.
Sorry, Lavish, were you saying something?
Yeah, there is some disturbance. So could you shut off your video? It might become a bit more clear.
Okay, sorry about that. Okay.
Thank you.
Scale up, and this of course creates. I think in addition to the scale up of spending, that also important to recognize that it is also a reallocation of spending. So today, much of our spending goes towards high emissions assets. About 65% of our spending is on high emissions assets. So this is things like fossil-based power, internal combustion engine vehicles. In the future, that number needs to be exactly reversed. About 30% would go to high emissions assets globally, 70% low emissions assets. And so this goes back to what Dr. Ahluwalia was alluding to as risk, a fundamental reevaluation of how we do risk-adjusted returns, and a wholesale implication for how finance is best incentivized and returns are best accrued. Another example which we've talked about a lot in this conversation, but it is the uneven nature of the transition. And what we find with our work is that developing countries are indeed more exposed. By exposure, I mean more and more of their economy, so a higher share of their GDP, a higher share of their capital stock, a higher share of their jobs are in sectors that will need to transform, everything from fossil-based power to high emissions industry to agriculture and forestry. And so there's a whole-scale transformation that all economies will need to undertake, but in particular, transition exposure score, developing countries are substantially more exposed to the transition, will need to make more shifts, participate and
Meghla, you have 2 more minutes, please.
Okay, great. With that, I mean, maybe just to close with 2 more slides. We've also taken, so one aspect of the unevenness is how much economies are exposed differentially to the transition and would need to undertake shifts. Another aspect of this unevenness is how that $3.5 trillion is split across countries. And I think $1 trillion, it says that developing countries would need to spend, our estimates would suggest about 40% or so is in developing countries, so roughly in line with that 1 trillion estimate. But I think what is more critical is that as you look as a share of GDP, for developing countries, that spend is substantially higher than for developed countries. So it's not just the quantum of capital, it's also the capacity of economies to spend that capital that is unevenly distributed across economies. Now, this in and of itself is not a troubling fact, because you would expect developing economies to spend more as a share of their GDP as they grow. The challenge is that the ability to deploy this capital, low emissions assets that we don't have a history of spending capital on, where there are concerns about the implications on jobs, where there are concerns about stranded asset risk, when government revenues may be strained as economies transform, deploying this capital may become more and more challenging for developing countries relative to developed countries. So it's not just the quantum of capital, but it's also the nature of that capital that becomes harder for developing countries to spend on. And so with that, maybe I'll just close with this slide to say what this actually then means, I think, beyond just a policy response is actually a whole of system response. Of course, was more focused on policy, but what our research emphasizes is the need for multiple stakeholders to play a role, of course, with policy at the center in driving that. Stakeholder on this chart, from companies to governments and multilateral institutions, financial institutions, a whole set of new enabling institutions, needing to play a role to drive us towards net zero. I think when we then translate this to the last thing I would leave you all with is maybe the desire to think about the net zero agenda for a country a bit more holistically than the first point on this slide. We often think about a net zero agenda as what do countries need to do to invest to decarbonize and secure low carbon growth. But I actually think, sadly, it's a little bit more complicated of a picture than that. So for countries, particularly developing countries that have large high emitting sectors, it's important certainly to think about investing in decarbonizing and securing low carbon growth. But it's also important to think about what happens to the industries that are exposed and need to make shifts today. What are the supports? What is the opportunity to benefit as other countries transform and the world transforms to a net zero economy? So let's not just think about this as a risk, but also an opportunity. If you think about a hydrogen economy or a biofuels economy or opportunities from forestry, there's a whole range of new industries that can grow. And then finally, as Ulka alluded to,
Meghla, may I now ask you to close, please?
So with that, I will end my remarks and hand back to Lavish. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was very good, and we are thankfully on schedule. May I ask now Mr. Nitin Desai to make his remarks? You're on mute. You're on mute, sir.
Thank you very much. So I think let me first begin by thanking Montek and Utkarsh for the very fine paper that they've prepared and the presentation they made. Much of what I would have said has been said by the previous three commentators. I wanted to add a point which has not been adequately discussed I don't mean in this meeting, but generally in the global discussions on climate. On the issue of equity, I think you're right. I don't know whether I can share screens, so let me try. But if you look at the issue of equity, then I had done a calculation once, and let me see whether I have a way of sharing a screen. Yes, I do. Has it come?
Yes.
So you can see that that in many ways, if you really are to do the equitable thing, which was there in the table that Montek presented, the last column, where in a sense everybody has an equal right to what remains of carbon space in terms of the population, then the target net zero dates for China would have to come down to 2033, to USA for 2028, EU, UK for 2037. So 2050 is just not good enough as far as their reaching net zero in an equitable way is concerned. If they go to 2050, as they propose, they will use up more of the remaining carbon space than what any principle of climate justice would consider it reasonable for them to do so. I don't think this is going to happen, but I just thought it would be worth putting it on the record. But I don't wish to elaborate on this point all that much. I guess a point about finance is also well taken. There are many assessments of the range of finance required. I think one dimension that I think we should stress increasingly is that a significant part of the investments that will take place now, which will have to be directed in a manner which is climate friendly, are going to be privately financed. Are going to be privately, they're not necessarily going to be financed through public resources where you can impose that as a condition. Will private finance put that condition in? It is happening. ESG is growing. And recently, a very good report has been put together, Capital as a Force for Good, which has made an assessment of what our requirements are for sustainable development, what the shortages are, etc. And basically, they have come up with some rather dramatic numbers on the way in which the ESG thing is spreading and how increasingly private finance companies are insisting on the ESG requirement. I have some numbers on that if anybody's interested, but I suggest you look at the report. One, the cost of saving. Can you guys see the screen? Can you see this?
No, we can't.
Oh, I have to do screen sharing. I forgot. No. 1 second. Anyhow, it's not terribly crucial. I would recommend that you have a look at this report. The point I would stress more is on the whole business of two things. One, how do we look at the management of climate change? I think several people have said the need for integrating it into development. A couple of points I would make here. One, a lot of people have been talking about how climate, two things. One, how in India, for instance, the link between growth and climate energy increase has been going down. Now, part of the reason for that is the link between manufacturing growth and GDP growth has been going down. Such a large part of India's growth over the past decade or so has been from services that you would, to some extent, that would account for it. If we go in more significantly for large-scale manufacturing growth, as the government intends to, you may find a little difference in that elasticity number that would emerge from the past data. And globally, the difference between the developed countries and developing countries, which was to some extent reflected in the numbers which were just presented by Meghna, is also partly a difference between the fact that in the developing countries, it is very much service oriented, and there isn't any large scale investment in infrastructure, etc., which is taking place in developed countries. So this is one. The second thing is you really have to integrate adaptation and mitigation. This is what yesterday IPCC released a report on risk, adaptation, and resilience. And one of the things in that report which comes out is that resilience is basically combining mitigation and adaptation in how you handle development. The both things have to go together, particularly if you're looking at issues like water or agriculture or forests and things of this sort. These are, I think, things which I just want to elaborate. Most of these things have been covered. The point I really want to stress is something which has not received sufficient attention in either the global discussions or generally. And that is that most of our discussions have tended to focus attention on how to cope with climate change by supply side modifications, changing the way in which we produce goods and services. I think it is increasingly clear that we are not going to get to anywhere like what we want in terms of 1.5 degree limit in the temperature increase, unless we also address issues on the demand side management. And this has not received much attention. And mostly people are looking for answers mostly in terms of supply side modifications. These are the numbers on how the distribution of climate emissions are if you look at consumption, if you look at consumer data. And as you can see, the top 1% accounts for 15% of climate carbon emissions, the next 9% for 32%, so the top 10% accounts for nearly half, 47%. The middle 40 is about 43%, and that will be averages. The bottom 50 is about 10, and these are the per capita consumption of the top 1%, top 9%, the 9%, the 40%, and the 50%, and you can see the huge difference. Now, if we want to address
2 more minutes.
If you want to address this issue of consumption management, it'll have to be a policy which is directed at lifestyles with upper income groups. And more than 50% of the upper income groups are in the rich countries, and most of the remaining 50% are in the middle income countries. So to some extent, this issue of lifestyle, which was raised by the Prime Minister in COP26, really means that we have to impress on the industrial countries that unless they start addressing issues of demand side management, we are not going to be able to get to where we want to, particularly because what they are planning in terms of their net zero commitments of 2050 are frankly unreasonable in terms of what their fair share of climate space ought to be. Equally within countries, we will have to target it at higher income groups. So I would say that we have to start moving beyond supply side modifications into demand side management, and we have to increasingly see supply side modifications as something which is where adaptation and mitigation and growth are integrated in the way in which decide projects and programs and policies. So let me stop here. Thank you.
Thank you. So may I now request Mr. Ahluwalia, do you have any comments before we start the formal Q&A session?
Well, I'd just like, and I'm sure Utkarsh joins me in this, just like to thank all the participants. They're very, very helpful comments, and we made notes on them. And, when we produce the version more specific for India, we will try to respond to these. I mean, broadly, I agree with the broad thrust of what has been said. So let's go straight into the wider discussion based on questions from the rest of whatever the audience.
Thank you. If anyone who's in the panelists would like to answer a question, please do raise your hands up so then I can call you out. But first time for all the participants, audience, the paper is available at the CSEP website. And it's I'll just ask someone from our communications team to share the link in the Q&A box. So first, I'd like to ask, I'll just throw this question, and just I'd like everyone to consider their responses to it. And this is from Paolo Chiarelli. What is the role of nuclear energy in the energy mix for the future? Since wind and solar are variable and battery technologies, the battery technology still has a long way to go. Can nuclear really fill some of these gaps? Oh, I'm sorry. This is from
you're asking
Ayush.
You're asking me to
sorry.
respond. I mean,
I'm sorry. This is by Ayush Khare, and I have another question. So I'm going to just read out both of these, and then after that we'll another one is on biofuels, and which has been pointed out by more than one respondent, has really not been carried in depth in the paper. So the question is, biofuels are mentioned in your study as an option for transport decarbonization. In view of the recent Indian government moves to increase biofuel uptake, how do you see the biofuels contribution in reducing emissions in India? So I have two questions, one on the nuclear energy and the other one on biofuel.
Yeah. No, let me just say on nuclear, it's quite clear to me that the potential is very large. As far as I know, the only constraint is the difficulty in getting all the clearances done. Post Fukushima, resistance on the part of local populations for setting up nuclear plants has been very high. Now, I don't know how effectively this can be tackled, but to my mind, that is a known technology. And, I would have thought that it could and should have a larger role. I just don't know what the technical view is on how to handle, disposal of byproducts. And that is something, we've not actually addressed. On biofuels, I mean, the problem with biofuels is that, as you say, it's certainly one element. Large-scale use resort to biofuels will run into land scarcity problems, unless you're referring to simply agricultural waste, where, of course, whatever you can do should be done. I don't see the biofuels as providing a big enough response, certainly not big enough compared to what, let's say, nuclear could do, if we can overcome the resistance of people to have plants located nearby.
Okay. May I ask anyone else among the panelists who have worked on these areas to share their views? Yeah, please go ahead.
Lavish, thanks.
Yeah,
the nuclear, I think we have to understand that, yes, potential is large, but potential is large if we look at the entire, the three-phase cycle. And Rahul on the panel has done a very nice paper many years back on this. If we look at the current once-through cycle design without reprocessing, then we will be importing a decent amount of uranium, either natural uranium or enriched uranium, to build the reactors, because our domestic uranium resources are limited. So if nuclear has to, reach a level where it can provide large amount of electricity, and then we will be relying on the fast breeder reactor, eventually getting to thorium, which I think is long way away. We have been trying to build a 500 megawatt reactor in Kalpakkan, the breeder reactor, and it's taking a long time to complete that. So the transition to breeder reactors and then to thorium, I think, is a long way away. And that's the reason I said that, there needs to be an honest assessment of the potential of nuclear power, because the DAE has been saying this for the last 20 years, that nuclear will get to so many 100 gigawatts by 2030, 40, etc., which hasn't happened for a plethora of reasons. So that would be my take on nuclear. Although there have been scholars who have argued that India may not really require that scale of nuclear power for our climate goals. And there was a debate in current science on these issues. So, yeah.
Thank you. So the next question is from an anonymous attendee. And this is on an issue on the institutional issue, which I think almost every discussant also mentioned. And the question is fairly specific. What could be the responsive regulatory interventions and regulatory coordination in helping India achieve its climate goals? So essentially, the focus is on the regulatory interventions part.
Yeah. Well, actually, I mean, by its very nature, we mentioned that we need to do some innovative thinking on this. I think we are, as far as regulatory related to the electricity sector is concerned, we do have a constitutional breakdown in the sense that distribution is in the hands of the states. There's no question that with all those constraints, the present manner in which electricity regulation is both handled and staffed is very, very old-fashioned. We're just putting retired civil servants onto these boards on the assumption that really there's very little in terms of technical options that they need to explore. Whereas to my mind, if you're going to bring in renewable energy in a big way, you're going to have a lot more interstate trading. You're going to have systems. The pricing arrangements have to build in the kind of flexibility needed to absorb this kind of power. And I quite honestly think that this is an area of major, major institutional reform. It's not simple in the sense that, I mean, I'm not technically myself competent to fully pronounce on this or even to pronounce confidently on this, but it's quite clear that we need to make sure that our electricity regulatory system is, if you like, in a class that reflects the fact that this is an area where technology is changing very rapidly. Markets have to develop. It's not going to be government dominated. And what are the kind of developments that we need in markets? But before that, the most important institutional change, to my mind, is really the viability of the distribution system. I mean, we've got a system in which we've got a lot of people capable of producing electricity, and they've demonstrated that they can do it. And it all goes through a sort of bottleneck, which is publicly owned distribution system. It's not so much publicly owned, but it's actually totally subordinated to political demands. And how that's going to change is really the issue. Right now, the solar corporation, the corporation that buys solar power, is actually bypassing this issue. I mean, if you want to produce solar power in India, you're able to actually sell it to a central government corporation so that you have some reasonable assurance that you will get paid. And it's their job to pass it on to states and make sure that they pay them. But if the volume of electricity coming from these sources is going to go up to 60% and more, then the idea that all of this is going to be backstopped by the central government financially just doesn't make any sense. So I think that's another area that we need. We need to see big changes towards greater financial viability. But at the root of both regulatory change and making the distribution system financially viable is actually a political willingness to do that. And if somehow the political system has to be educated, and my guess, by the way, is that the only way that'll happen is if states with different degrees of governance success end up performing better. But if we insulate misperformance in a state by the central government sort of stepping in, then there'll be no incentive to actually improve governance levels at the distribution end. It's easier said than done. And but I mean, I said right at the beginning that a 50-year program is one thing. What you need is a 10-year concrete program of things that we need to do. And I would put this very much in that first 10 years. And maybe we'll have to experiment, because different things may work in different places. I mean, for example, I've seen some work. Rahul Tongia has done some, and others also. In many states, the problem is that they don't actually collect what is due. That's one kind of governance failure. In other states, they collect what is due, but the tariffs are so distorted that the thing makes a huge loss. So, two different kinds of problems, two different sources of the same problem, contributing to financial unviability.
Thank you. So on that note, we are reaching towards the end of this. We have only a few minutes left. So may I just ask any of the panelists if you would like to have, share your closing remarks on this? Starting with Mr. Desai. Yes, please.
Yeah, I think what Montek has identified is the crucial barrier. The transition to an electricity-based economy, which is what the net zero requires an electricity system which is very different from what we have today. One, the grid will have to be different. When you have energy coming from multiple sources, thousands and thousands of sources, then you can't have the highly centralized grid management that you have now. You'll have to have a hierarchy of grids. And second, you can't have a hierarchy of grids unless you have a market system for trading in power. The present system of bilateral deals between the supplier and the buyer is not going to work. It is going to require a radical change in grid design, in power distribution design. And I think I don't know how that is going to happen. I don't see how we can transit from a thoroughly, completely impossible system that we have now with huge discom losses to the system that I'm talking about, which is a market-based system with decentralized grid management.
Thank you.
Lavish, can I add one thing?
Yeah, sure.
I wanted to thank the panelists. And there's one thing which actually almost all of them have said, which I do think we've mentioned also, and that is this thing requires what is called a whole of the economy approach. I mean, nothing would be worse than somebody assuming we know what to do, but there's this climate change problem, so let's discuss how to fix that. I mean, it actually really requires a re-engineering of how you look at the whole economy in all aspects. I think somebody mentioned that clearly there's an institutional side to it. I'm sticking my neck out, but in government, everything is delegated to a ministry. I mean, every class of problems is dealt with by a ministry. And historically, climate change has been dealt with by the Ministry of Environment and Forests. Now, frankly, no single ministry can actually encompass all this. I mean, even the finance ministry, we don't have a single energy ministry, although we've improved by combining some of those things. You do need an institutional mechanism in which the 10-year program for getting the climate change agenda onto a monitorable and internally consistent and effectively financed manner is put together. And then the ministry is concerned, live with the consequences and follow up to implement what is in their areas. Somebody mentioned that maybe Niti Aayog could do it or somebody else. Doesn't matter. I'm not so concerned with who does it, but there has to be some institutional thing. And there's been a tendency to say, well, that sounds like old-fashioned planning. It's not actually old-fashioned planning, but it is new-fashioned planning, and we have to find some way of doing it.
Thank you. Mekla, you're also on our advisory council on climate change. So what are your thoughts, and also something on the research directions that people who are in this space could be working on?
Maybe just two very quick thoughts, and then over on time. I cannot agree more with the last point that was made, right? I think this need for whole of system transformation is crucial. There are other countries that have tried to handle this by creating what they call climate change committees that have tried to embed, to create a plan that then gets embedded in different parts of government. I think any such whole of system approach would also require government working with the private sector. Someone mentioned that a lot of the capital that needs to flow will need to come from the private sector, and finding ways to engage the private sector in this will also be incredibly important. So I think both cross-government but also cross-sectoral approaches are going to be key here. So that's point number one. I think point number two, in terms of future directions of research and where I think we need more thinking. One is on just the climate finance topic more broadly. The paper started to identify the need for public and private finance, the need for multilateral institutions, but really a thoughtful and detailed understanding of what sources of capital are, what bottlenecks towards driving capital flows are when you look at different sectors, when you look at different countries, where there are supply side gaps, where there are demand side gaps. I think this whole climate finance topic needs to be explored much more. I think secondly, the adaptation topic will need to be explored much more. Today's IPCC report, as Ulka mentioned, has started to do some of that, but we really don't have a costing of how much we need to really spend holistically on adaptation. We don't have an understanding of what role different sectors need to play. We don't have an understanding of how to incentivize adaptation. So I think the whole adaptation needs substantial more focus, which I'm actually hopeful will happen just given where COP27, COP28 are going to be located. I think adaptation will be more on the agenda. And then the third,
So
this may be the third quickly, is just this whole question of how we scale up and the deployment of technologies, particularly given the conversations in Europe now about energy prices. I think there's a lot of concern about a disorderly energy transition. So this whole question of how do we drive towards orderliness on scale up of supply chains, availability of resources, solving land use issues, etc., I think is a third important area of work.
Thank you. Ulka, may I also, yeah, you have to leave. So, okay, you could.
Just 30 seconds, one comment I just wanted to make, just one request to Dr. Ahluwalia. On this aspect of this institutional setup required to drive climate action, I would urge you, sir, to have a paper specifically focused on this. And the reason I say, because your long experience in the government and running planning commission for a decade, I think you're probably ideally positioned to advise what should be this institutional mechanism, how it should work with the ministries, how it should work with these state governments. It will be great if you can have one paper specifically on that. Just one suggestion.
Thank you.
Thanks. Actually, on the
Mr. Ahluwalia, before you respond, I'd like, because Ulka needs to leave, so if she could just put in her comments and then we can respond.
Nothing really from my side, Lavish. Just wanted to say that, the energy part is maybe the easy part, even though we've been talking about how complex it is. It is not going to be enough. We are going to need material efficiency improvements, and that is a whole different ballgame. But here again, the power of instruments like government procurement and standards can be really quite important. In the US, for example, even city governments, state governments are setting standards for the purchase of low carbon steel, low carbon concrete. I think we can also start thinking ahead and start thinking of options like these for the future. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Mr. Ahluwalia.
Actually, I think I agree with what Ulka just said. There are lots of things that we can do. On the question of, I mean, I don't believe I'm in any very special position to advise the government. And there are lots of people advising the government. But in the India-specific paper that we are currently trying to produce, we will perhaps address these issues a little more carefully. But, in the end, I would say there are only two things. One is the present arrangement where the ministry in charge of climate change is MOEF is simply wrong. It shouldn't be. Maybe it should be the Ministry of Energy if you can't have a separate, but it's not just energy. The whole electrification, the changes in urban transport systems, it has to be a whole of the economy approach. Now, probably the best thing is to set up such a group in the PMO, and then let them mobilize the government in whatever way they like. Because in any system, in the past, even if you have a council, there's always a ministry that's actually in charge of that council. And the important thing is that if you have a ministry that doesn't control any of the levers that have to be controlled, then you're not going to get much of an end result. But let me think about it. We'll put this in, and I would invite panelists who want us to spell out this idea to send us an email giving their thoughts on what might be the most sensible thing for India. And I'll pursue it with one or two individually anyway. Thank you.
Thank you. So on that note, we would like to close this. We're a few minutes ahead of schedule, but I mean over schedule, sorry. So I'd first like to thank the panelists, and some of whom have joined in at an unearthly hour in the morning from the US. So thank you so much for being here, Mr. Desai, Dr. Bharadwaj, Dr. Meghla Krishnan, and Ulka, who's just left us. Thank you so much. We really appreciate this, and we promise to be in touch with you, on the discussions that have taken place here. For all the audience, you have been very good. Thank you so much. We have received a whole range of questions, and we again promise you that we will be responding to them individually. Unfortunately, we could not take many of the questions on board here. And finally, the team at CSEP, thank you so much. Our communications team, which includes Trishna, Ribu, Malvika, who've been amazing, having set this up in such a short while, and also Monica, who's been working with me closely to make sure that everything goes on smoothly. So thank you once again, and we hope to be in touch with all of you on these matters.
Thanks a lot.